You're listening to the WCEN podcast. Hello, hope everybody is doing well. My name is Peaks, and you're listening to the WCEN podcast. The aim of this podcast is to keep the multi-faith communities and the community in general informed of services and how to access them at this time during this global pandemic that we're going through in the UK lockdown. This platform is to share and express the needs and experiences of what's happening in the communities, from the different things that are going through, what people's coping mechanisms are. We're going to be speaking with people from faith leaders to public health sector members, people who are working in healthcare, people who are volunteers. It doesn't matter what it is, as long as there's something to contribute and to uplift the people's spirits at this time. Now, on today's podcast, we are going to be speaking with Dr. Rochelle Burgess. She is a lecturer in global health and deputy director of the UCL Centre for Global Non-Communicable Diseases at the Institute for Global Health at UCL. A fellow of the Royal Society of Public Health, PhD, founder and director of the UCL's Global Network on Mental Health and Child Marriage, and much, much more accolades that I could mention. But here she is. Dr. Rochelle, are you there?
I'm here.
Hi, how are you today?
I'm all right. It's Friday and sunny.
Yeah, lovely. It's
so
always good.
You take the wins where you can.
That's it. If you can explain to everybody who's listening, I gave you a brief intro there, but you've got so many accolades and so many wonderful things that you've achieved. If you can tell us a little overview about who you are, where you're from, and a little bit of history about your work, and then just up to the kind of current climate that we're in right now.
Yeah, sure. So I am a community health psychologist by training. Originally from Canada, but moved to London about 12 or so years ago, maybe more. I stopped counting after a while.
Mm-hmm.
And I mostly work in the field of community health and community mobilization. And what that means is that I'm really interested in using sort of research and academia as a platform to highlight the ways in which communities mobilize to save themselves, and also to highlight how successes can be built on. So really working from a strengths-based approach in my work, rather than a deficit-based one that only sees illness or has illness as its sort of primary motivation. For the last 10 years or so, that has mostly been focusing on mental health. I've done work in other areas before, but the bulk of my work is around mental health and well-being in populations that usually are labeled hard to reach. When I teach, I tend to put hard to reach in brackets, because I don't think that groups are hard to reach. I think that systems just aren't interested in engaging with people where they are, and they try to expect people to change for systems rather than systems adapting to people. So I work with traditionally labeled hard to reach groups, or groups that are excluded from full participation in society, either because of race or income or gender. I've done lots of work in South Africa around women's mental health, women affected by HIV and AIDS, and sort of looking at how women cope and succeed in really challenging settings. And also do work in South London, mostly in Wandsworth with WCEN, around sort of community mobilization around mental health for BME populations, and all of the amazing work that you guys do on that side. And there's other bits and bobs in there around sort of racial inequality and gender inequality and those types of things that I research. But those would be the two biggest pieces.
That's a lot of work. So we're
Yeah,
going to
it is.
break that
It
down
is.
over the course of this during the course of this conversation. But I mean,
Yeah.
so kind of going back, you says that you're from Canada. Do you mind me asking what your kind of heritage is?
Yeah, no, of course. So I was born in Canada. I was first generation. Both my parents are Jamaican. Moved to Canada in the 70s, um, independent of each other, two Jamaicans just meeting in Canada at a party, I was told once, when my dad was a DJ. And yeah, so a lot of my sort of understandings of how communities self-mobilize to keep themselves going when they've been sort of overlooked by this sort of the state apparatus or those types of structures comes from my growing up in a Jamaican household. Um, we were definitely one of the lucky ones. Both my parents worked and had reliable jobs, but we grew up in a town, or I grew up in a town where we were one of the few Black families. So it was very um, lots of different pressures around that, and sort of the creation of community through cousins and networks, and basically anybody from a Caribbean background then becomes your family, you know. So yeah, I think it's that's been something that sort of fed into my long-standing interest to say, wait a minute, like people survive. People survive in situations that you can't even imagine. And maybe that survival should be the starting point for where we plan for interventions, how we think about solutions, rather than coming in from the top and assuming that that you have all the answers.
So where did all your kind of like studies and your passion for that kind of begin? Did that start in Canada? Did that happen when you moved to the UK? What was kind of your journey from that? Where did that inspiration to study this really come from, and where did that kind of happen for you?
Uh, I guess in a way it was always sort of just below the surface in Canada. One of those pressures growing up being sort of first generation was this idea that somebody in this family is going to be a doctor. I'm sure lots of people will have
Yeah,
heard these stories.
Jamaica and
um,
Africans, yes.
yeah, definitely. Like basically, the Caribbean is Africa, right?
Of course, yeah,
That is Africa, and just sort
definitely.
of a generations removed. Um, and my work in South Africa, new work in Zimbabwe, when I've been to Kenya, the most fascinating and amazing things happen where people sort of see me and they say, "Oh, you look like my cousin." And I do look like their cousin. Like you show me a picture, it's like, "Oh yeah, I do look like this woman from Kenya who I've never met." And um, Jamaican patois is almost identical to Nigerian patois. Like so, I can, so they are very much connected, and so Jamaican Caribbean mums, those things that go around the internet, they're all the same. Like I recognize that stuff entirely. So anyway, it was someone's job to become a doctor. I was the oldest of four, so it was my job. So I very dutifully pursued it for many years, failing organic chemistry many times along the way, and also having this sort of like activist spirit that just sort of was around community engagement. And I sort of took some classes in psychology in Canada and really got passionate about sort of what psychology could do and what it could mean for these other things I was doing in my activist life. And then, just a bunch of sort of happenstance circumstances led me to finding about this master's program in the UK at the London School of Economics that was called Health, Community and Development. And that program basically brought together all of these three interests that I've just sort of had in different parts of my life, brought them all together in one place. Very sadly, that program no longer exists, and it's a real shame because it it was one of a kind in its interest in thinking about health and what makes people healthy and the choices that people have to make, or behaviors they have to engage in to be healthy. How that overlaps with this idea of community and what it means to belong or to be excluded from different parts and dimensions of society, and development, and the idea that the world is a deeply unequal place, and so people's access to the resources they need to be healthy are predetermined by a lot of sort of bigger geopolitical realities. So it was an amazing program. And I came here and I said to my mother, I'm just going to do it 1 year, then I'm going to go to medical school. That was a decade ago. More than a decade, actually.
Yeah, so you found where your passion and your heart lies, I guess.
Yeah, and then that was it. And I sort of just went on that.
I hope your parents are proud. I mean, I'm sure they are.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah. So, I mean, speaking of all that you've just mentioned there, and how communities impact healthcare, all these kind of things, and how lifestyles can affect mental health and such. You undertook some research and evaluations of faith networks and mental health work in Wandsworth. So can you tell us about that kind of work, and was that with WCEN?
Yeah, it was. So I got connected to WCEN back in 2014, I think it is.
Wow.
And sort of was asked to do an evaluation of their, what then was just sort of the Black Pastors Family Therapy Network. It's now been expanded to include a whole range of sort of faith groups who have been trained in a particular modality of therapy called systemic family therapy, and trying to sort of evaluate what kind of opportunities this created for creating new spaces to respond to mental health inequalities in Wandsworth and South London, and potentially much bigger than that. And I think it remains one of the most inspiring programs I've come across in sort of the many years I've been doing sort of evaluation work and intervention development around mental health and community mental health specifically. Because what is so special about that program was that it was created through a really collaborative process of starting with sort of this group of Black pastors who, many of whom from sort of backgrounds that are from the Caribbean or Africa, knowing what their communities needed and not being able to find it anywhere. And so coming together to try and figure out how to create something to respond to that need and how to do it yourself, and making strategic partnerships and alliances with sort of formal systems to enable that to happen. And what I think was so special about the Family Therapy Network projects is that it doesn't ask people to change the language that they make sense of the world in order to engage with care and things to enable your mental well-being. It sort of meets you where you are. It acknowledges the importance of family, the importance of networks, the importance of faith to so many people around the world, in how they make decisions about when they might want to go to see a care provider or not, in decisions that can sometimes be protective for their mental health, and sometimes can also be challenging for their mental health. But it doesn't try to change that paradigm of sense making. It, as I said, it meets them where they are, and it uses languages that make sense to people. So the language of faith is the big piece here, to get people to a space where they can talk about their mental health, where they can um, engage with these ideas and also think about what shape any forms of maybe formal therapy might take. And it gets around some of those sort of like really sticky challenges that the UK has around its mental health sector, in the sense that, talk therapies and psychological therapies are overwhelmingly staffed by white British practitioners, which can create in some settings a disconnect in that language of sense making. And so how do you speak to someone about the anxieties that are caused by your oppression to somebody who looks like your oppressor? These are things that can have a real impact on the I guess the quality of a therapeutic relationship, which has been shown in studies to be one of the most important factors to what makes therapy effective. And it sort of scales up sort of people in the community who are already doing work to make that community of geographical community or people in these faith-based communities better and stronger. It gives those people a new set of skills so they can contribute to people's lives in another way. So it really is this dream thing that I never expected to exist. One of those programs that put theory and all of this theory that I had been studying for many years into practice.
So, I mean, in the wake of obviously what's happened with this global pandemic, the UK is on lockdown, and your work with these faith communities, I mean, how do you think that work that you guys have done has impacted what the current situation is now? How prepared do you think that these networks are now, and obviously the government and healthcare system is with your research and findings?
Well, I would imagine that in spaces where those community networks are already very strong, they are continuing to be strong, adaptive, and finding new ways to reach out to people in their parishes and in their mosques and in their communities. The way in which that engagement happens might be different. You might not have the sort of big communal gatherings, but those connections are still there, and so they sort of take new forms and new shape. So yeah, I would be quite hopeful actually that those communities might be a bit more resilient because those structures are already in place. Um, I guess a big concern is that a lot of organizations like these, like the ones that I met doing that evaluation work, basically struggle with resources. Right, these are the organizations that tend to have the least amount of sort of like financial resources at their disposal to sort of redeploy and switch gears very rapidly to respond to a new kind of threat. So one of the things that would be really important is to try and ensure that sort of government and local authority support has begun to trickle down into these grassroots organizations that are actually doing so much work and have been doing work for a really long time in the communities, rather than necessarily reinventing the wheel or creating new groups. And I think the spirit of what is happening in a lot of these in the family therapy network is also potentially happening in some of these COVID self-help groups that have sort of popped up all over the country, where there's sort of an interest in trying to connect with people who might be isolated and trying to support those in your immediate geographical area. When you, in that sense, sort of organizing your idea of community around place, whereas the family network is organized community around place, but to a larger extent, sort of faith. So yeah, I'm hopeful, but it's always a challenge of how much good can people do when they don't have enough resources. And so the organizations and the communities where the resource investment was already low, it's probably going to remain low. And that would be one of the big hopes as a positive to come out of this, is that if we know that COVID affects communities of color disproportionately, then that's where targeted investment should be. It shouldn't be blanket investments. You know which groups are already more vulnerable because of pre-existing inequalities that are structurally determined, embedded in the veins of how society is organized. We already know all of that. That kind of information can be used to protect vulnerable populations, and really thinking about what we're saying counts as vulnerable, right? So this idea of vulnerability is very much at the moment organized around age, and that is only one dimension of vulnerability. There's huge intersections of vulnerability in the British population and global population, and we should use our understanding of those intersections to have targeted support in addition to sort of the general support that we're trying to provide everybody. Some people will need more to get by. Some people will need different things to get by. And that should be a part of strategic thinking as well. Because achieving mental health right now during this crisis is not just about the psychological dimensions of well-being. It's not just about sort of the loneliness or the isolation. That is a part of it. But COVID-19, the virus has also created a deepening of the inequalities that were already present in our society. And so the people who didn't have enough to eat have less to eat. And the people who didn't have enough money have less money. And these structural realities also play a huge part in people's ability to be mentally and emotionally well. These structural pathways have been shown in many parts of the world, mostly when we look in sort of countries in the global south, like South Africa, where I've done a lot of work, that poverty means that you can be more likely to develop depression. And if you were poor when you develop depression, your poverty becomes worse. So an interaction between, and a cycle between sort of your social reality driving you into experiences of mental health crises, and then your environment keeping you in those crises once you have the mental health condition. And this is a huge part of what challenges people face that isn't being talked about, that isn't being thought about properly yet, which I hope can begin to change in coming days and weeks, because we need it too.
Most definitely. I mean, in all your years of research, and you mentioned the program that you did when you were studying, which was quite an exciting project for you to participate in. Sadly, had to kind of end. But now this is obviously on a global scale. This is kind of like the first in so many people's experiences living. This must be a really interesting time for you to kind of study on further. I mean, what is there any research right now during this that you're kind of conducting right now?
Yeah, I guess little bits. I've been thinking about it and trying to think about where my efforts are best placed. So one thing that I've been doing is, so I moved out of London. I now live sort of just north of London, out towards sort of Harlow in Hertfordshire. And one of the things I've been doing is sort of supporting our local public health department to develop their strategy for responding to mental health, and putting these ideas of thinking about how sort of these social and political challenges
Is that
feed
specifically,
into that.
sorry,
Yeah.
is that
Sorry?
specifically to the BME communities that you're doing that for, or is it for everyone type of thing?
Well, I think in doing it, I'm thinking about the BME community. but it is something that's blanket for everybody, if that makes sense, right? So there are ways in which you can design programs that will help BME populations as well as everybody else. But BME populations are probably more likely to experience that pathway to mental health problems. And so by putting it in there, it sort of takes care of both sides. But another thing that I'm sort of thinking through and beginning to work through with WCEN again is trying to think about how we can document the experiences of BME communities, and particularly young people who I think will be really hard hit by what's happening right now. Their experiences of lockdown and COVID and the increased sort of policing powers in relation to COVID and the lack of access to public spaces, the loss of sort of whole cadres of sort of employment where young people tend to be more likely to be employed in sort of the hospitality sectors and things like that. So those more likely to be in housing where there isn't green spaces. A lot of policy will get written in coming days and weeks and months. And I think it's really important that research also document the experiences of BME communities throughout this, so their voices inform future planning, rather than just having research that explains, again, that BME populations are more likely to experience it. That's not the research I'm interested in. I'm interested in how people survive it and what do we need to do to make that process of survival easier. So that's something that we're thinking through right now, myself and the director of WCN, Malik, are thinking through right now. And so hopefully in the coming weeks, you'll hear from us again about how communities of color, Black communities from the Caribbean, from Africa, from all over the world really that are in London, because the world is in London, can contribute their stories to this study.
Yeah, talking about the young people, what their coping mechanisms could be. I mean, with your experience, what would you advise young people and maybe even parents as well who may be overlooking things that, that may be taken for granted, that young people could just brush things off and when it all comes out, they'll just go back to normal. What would you advise from that for maybe people who are not coping with it so well? What would kind of your advice be to keep, their sanity during this time? Some strategies maybe.
It's a tough one because I'm even trying to remind myself of these strategies. So I think one of the biggest things that would be really important for people to do is to try and reframe what they think life needs to look like. So I think what tends to happen is people always, I know myself included, hold ourselves to standards that, because of the reality, need to shift. So things are not the same as they were, and they probably won't be the same after lockdown ends for many months and possibly a year. So you have to sort of try and forgive yourself, give yourself space to acknowledge actually that things will be different. And so you shouldn't hold yourself to the same sorts of standards of performance that you might have before. If you're somebody who has a job where you work from home, you're not going to perform to the same capacity that you did before all this happened, because this is a huge stressful thing that's just taken up everybody's space in terms of their brain and what they consume online and what messages get sent around on WhatsApp. It's everywhere. It's in the veins of society. So you have to give yourself space to accept that this slowing down means you hold yourself to different standards temporarily. You reimagine what could be done or should be done in a day. What is good enough? Good enough is actually great, because good enough is what helps you survive in uncertain times. And I guess another thing that's sort of connected to that is to find things to sort of celebrate. There's a siren, which is, and so finding things to celebrate that you manage to do and feel that you do well. I recognize that, just getting through another day is something that you should celebrate, because there are lots of people who don't. There are lots of people who may not make it to another day. And I guess the third thing would be to say it is completely normal under these circumstances to feel sad, to feel nervous, to feel anxious. This doesn't mean that you have a mental health condition. It means that this is how you are emotionally responding to a really hard and confusing situation. And what will be different is to figure out the difference between, well, what is an expected amount of anxiety and worries about this, and what is above and beyond that. And if you are feeling that it might be more than what is normal for you, then talk to somebody about it. There are helplines and resources that people can access to just have conversations if they're worried that it's too much, if it feels like it's too much, then definitely talk to somebody.
And is there some resources and contact details that you have that you can share for anybody who feels that way?
Just talking to somebody who you can trust is a good starting point to help relieve some of those anxieties, to feel that, and to be reminded that you're not the only one worrying about these things can be a huge sense of relief. So if you're not already talking to those people in your life on the phone or WhatsApp or House Party, the new app that everybody's talking about, then you can start, then you should start. We can be physically distant, but that actually doesn't mean socially distant, right? You can talk to people in your life. And, that can be the family, or it can be people outside of your family, anyone who you trust, where you feel that the space is safe.
Yeah. And in terms of yourself, there's going to be a lot of people as well who are maybe in the academic field that you're in, who are listening to this, professionals and things. I mean, you're given all this advice, you hear all these stories, you have to gather data. It might be a lot as well for you guys to be taken on each day as this keeps kind of going on. We're into an extended 3 weeks now of this lockdown. I mean, in terms of the kind of work that you do, how do you keep yourself together? How do you keep yourself as well? Taking a little bit of time out for yourself and things like that as well, because I know people as well like yourself as well, maybe parents and things, and you have to work from home. When you didn't, you had to go to the office and all that kind of stuff. So in terms of keeping yourself upbeat and taking that little bit of time out, what kind of things do you do to replenish yourself?
Probably not enough replenishing of myself.
Yeah.
I spend a lot of time trying to, I guess, trying to feel connected to something other than me. So whether that is just taking like a pause to create some mental space by standing outside and feeling the sun on my face, even for like 5 minutes. I find the sun really helps me, probably because I'm Jamaican, but it really like does something to make me feel more connected to myself and to the world. I try to make sure that I have time when I'm not working. So before, I used to do a lot of work on the weekends, and now I don't. Like, I try to leave space when I'm not working as not working time so that I can feel the difference. Because if you're working from home, then what is the difference, right? Like, you didn't go out to work and come back. Your home space is also your workspace. So the ability to actually shut off and not do work becomes even more important. And I try to watch things that will make me laugh when I watch television. So some light escapism. And it's not escapism, it's just enjoyment. Just do something that makes you laugh. And so, for me, that's been watching. Well, last night I watched the documentary about the Chicago Bulls final season, which is now on Netflix. And that made me incredibly happy because I grew up watching that team. And, so I was chatting to my brother on WhatsApp in Canada about the episodes and oh, did you see that? Remember that dunk that Jordan did in '97? And like just totally, but just completely not related to anything I have to think about with work. You need to give your mind spaces to do and think about other things.
Excellent. And in the wake of all that's happened, lastly, what would you like to see change for the better?
I would like the world to come out of this a more just place. For me, COVID has basically just shown everyone, because some of us already knew the world was unfair and unjust and unequal. But now everybody else seems to see it too. And you've got governments responding in ways that you never would have imagined to help people, to give organizations enough money to keep going that are working in sort of the charity sectors. Hotels opening their doors to offer shelter for women who are escaping abuse. People coming together to help their neighbors. These things shouldn't disappear just because the virus gets handled. These things should stick around so that the world can continue to benefit from these good things that have happened. So I guess in a way, I'd like to see, every key worker, and that's from sort of people who are doing rubbish collection, people who are driving buses, people who are driving tubes, nurses, doctors. I'd like people to be paid a wage that allows them to live a good and decent life from top to bottom of society. I'd like for governments to continue to give local authorities injections of funding so they can pay for social care for the most vulnerable. I would like all of these things to stay and for the world to become what it's clear, that it could be. If we can rehouse the homeless now, we surely could have done it 10 years ago. So let's not go backwards. Let's go forwards. Social and community development is the best preventative medicine for general health and mental health.
Listen.
So that's what I'd like.
And on that note, That was a wonderful wrapping up of everything. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing, and hopefully you'll continue on with WCEN and for yourself as well. So thank you. May you have an enjoyable rest of your day and keep healthy.
Thank you. You too. It was great chatting to you.
And you. Thank you. Take care.
Okay. Bye.
Bye. So that was Dr. Rochelle Burgess giving us a very insightful look into what's happening with the BMEs and all the research that's been going on. We will leave those links down below that she mentioned during there if you need some of those resources. If you want to keep up to date or you want to leave some feedback, tips on your experiences, then you can leave us a comment down below, or you can email us on info@wcen.org.uk. You can also go to the website where there's a lot of resources, downloads. You can check out the podcast show there, sign up to the newsletter to keep informed. If you want to go there, then you can please visit www.wcen.co.uk. If you want to find out what's going on with the latest government guidelines and healthcare, then please go and check out www.gov.uk, or you can check out www.wandsworth.gov.uk. Thank you so much. If you found this helpful, then please consider sharing it with somebody else. Make sure you subscribe, like, and share this. And yes, stay safe, stay well, and we'll see you on the next episode. Take care. You're listening to the WCEN podcast.